Hello and welcome to another Giant Slayer TFT how to play video. Today our analyst will be diving into how to play Warlords in patch 10.25. Warlords are a composition with a lot of similarities to Cultists, mainly in that they have a distinct early and mid-game power spike. But Warlords have struggled to be a consistently playable build until the last few patches, where it's been solidified as a viable composition within the meta. We'll be covering all the factors that go into playing Warlords, so let's go ahead and jump on in. But before we begin, please don't forget to click the links in our description. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come, so be sure to also follow our Giant Slayer TFT social media pages. Alright, let's get back to the video. Before we dive into how to play Warlords, let's first talk about the strengths and weaknesses when playing the comp. As we mentioned in the intro, Warlords are quite similar to Cultists. The reason is that they can both do well when you commit to them, especially in the mid-game when you have 6 of the traits. But they also both struggle if you're not hitting upgrades, as 1-star Warlords and 1-star Cultists tend not to do that well. Cultists need star levels to make Galio a real threat, and Warlords need to win rounds to gain bonus stats. Thus, we arrive at the main weaknesses of Warlords. They struggle when you aren't hitting upgrades. It sounds like an obvious statement, but for Warlords it's a crucial aspect of them to understand, since to play them you need to commit to the trait and champions. A lot of other comps can be played with a mix and match of traits and units, meaning losing rounds isn't as detrimental as it is for the scaling of Warlords. Warlords, on the other hand, need to win rounds, and the best way to do that is if you have a lot of upgraded champions. Sure, if you high roll an early Katarina too, you can probably skate by into a slightly weaker board, but most of the time you need a solid foundation of units to do well. Champions like Garen, Vi, and even Nidalee will help immensely in earning wins throughout stage 2 and 3, and you need to 2-star them for that. But that does bring us to the strength of Warlords in that they scale really well throughout the early and mid game. If you're sitting on at least 3 2-star units during the latter half of stage 2 and into stage 3, you'll likely be winning the majority of the rounds, and that means even more stats for the units. That can then be used to aim for a 6 Warlord spike during the mid game, which can carry you through until level 8. To recap, the weaknesses of Warlords is the reliance on them having to win rounds, meaning you need a strong board to make use of the trait. In addition to that, they don't scale that well into the late game unless you're able to play a bunch of 3-star champions or hit 9 Warlords. The strength of Warlords is that the bonus stats of the trait help them scale and spike during the early and mid game, especially with the Chosen. It's a great trait to use early and transition out of later on in the game when the units begin to fall off. Alright, let's switch gears back to breaking down how to play Warlords by talking about core items. When it comes to items, we first have to break down the potential item carries of the comp. Early on in the game, you're likely going to have items on champions like Nidalee or Garen, since they're easy to 2-star, plus finding a chosen Warlord of them is much more common. From there, Jarvan and Katarina are next for giving items to, and later on into the game, Azir is another late game legendary that should be given items. Of those champions, the primary carry tends to be Katarina. Jarvan can do a decent amount of damage, but he's more or less a utility champion and not a straight-up carry like Katarina is. Xin Zhao is an okay champion to give items to, as he can sort of carry, but at the end of the day, the prioritization should go to Cat. Katarina items can vary, but a few of the better ones are Hextech Gunblade, Hand of Justice, and Deathcap. Quicksilver is definitely a must on her, since you don't want to risk Katarina getting interrupted during the first cast of her ult. Basically, give her some type of healing and defensive focus item, a Quicksilver, and some type of extra spell damage item. Jarvan, Xin Zhao, and Azir can all be given various aura items like Zeke's Chalice or Locket. Chalice is the best one of the 3 since Warlords mainly do magic damage. Jarvan can also be given items like Blue Buff or Shojin to help him cast more often and earlier on in a fight. In addition to that, items like Deathcap or Ionic Spark can be good for extra damage. If you want to stack Xin Zhao, mainly look for defensive items like Guardian Angel or Sunfire Cape, since you can make them early on in the game. That said, the ideal items for Xin Zhao try to make use of his scaling defense by keeping him alive longer, so some type of healing item does well alongside of additional damage mitigators like Bramble Vest or Dragon's Claw. Overall, when it comes to items for Warlords, you can mostly stick to universally good items. The only items you should go for specifically will be something like Gunblade to give to your Katarina, but even then you can just use a Hand of Justice if you don't want to commit components to a specific comp. Next, let's talk about core champions and traits for Warlords. Well, this is a pretty easy section since the bulk of the composition is going to be Warlords. And if you've managed to hit a chosen Warlord and have a spatula, you can fully commit by going 9 Warlords for your late game. Of course, there is a bit of nuance to which Warlords you want to prioritize. Garen and Nidalee do really well early game, but do get outscaled quickly, so you can look to replace them in the mid game. Katarina, as mentioned, is the primary carry, so playing her is essential. Jarvan is also essential because of the CC he provides. That leaves us with Xin Zhao and Vi, neither of which you necessarily need to play Warlords with, but they definitely serve as good replacements to Garen and Nidalee. And of course, they're quite good if you can 2-star them during Stage 3, so don't neglect buying them from your shop. And later on in the game, you definitely want to play Azir. As for what traits you play with Warlords, it really depends on what stage of the game you're at. Early game, you can mainly focus on the traits that pair well with the Warlord champions like Vanguard, Sharpshooter, Brawler, and Keeper. Mid-game, you'll want to aim for 6 Warlords, and since Katarina is your carry, you want to give her an Assassin for extra damage. Pyke is an excellent choice in that case. From the mid-game and on, you may not stick with Warlords as your primary synergy. It's easy to transition into a different comp since you're mostly aiming to go for a fast level 8, assuming your mid-game was 6 Warlords. There's no specific transition to aim for, simply play what you hit when rolling at level 8. That said, legendaries are always a solid choice to replace your Warlord champions. And if you do hit 9 Warlords, well, you're playing 9 Warlords. There's not really any wiggle room at that point, though Jhin is a solid choice as the spatula holder. Otherwise, most legendaries like Kayn, Yone, or Zilean are great choices. Time to move on to how Warlords will play out at each stage of the game, beginning with the early game. There's not much that needs to be covered in regards to the early game as you're aiming to play standard. Keep leveling at regular intervals and play your strongest board. Don't try to force Warlords early on if you're not hitting the champion, since one of their weaknesses is needing to win in order to scale with the trait. One tip that you want to keep in mind is that you do want to play Warlord champions during PvE rounds as they count as wins for the trait bonuses. So even if you end up not using Garen or Nidalee, if you buy them in your early shops, make sure you have them on your board during the PvE rounds. So you level to 4 around 2-2, 5 at 2-5, and we're heading into Krugs. At this point, you want to begin looking for Katarina and Jarvan as you can easily transition into 6 Warlord mid-game at level 6. This is even easier if you can find a chosen Warlord. But overall, the early game is simple. Stick to playing your strongest board and level at regular times. Next up is the mid-game. The mid-game is where you can potentially hit a huge power spike with Warlords. Before we get too far ahead, let's take a step back and talk about level 6 and stage 3. As usual, level 6 is around 3-2 or 3-3 since most of the lobby is likely doing the same. Leveling will help you find the all-important Katarina as well as 2-starring your Jarvan or Vi. As you're leveling to 6, you can roll a little bit of your gold if you feel your board isn't strong enough or you're close to a few important upgrades. It's definitely not a bad idea to roll if you have a chosen Warlord at level 6 because you definitely want to play 6 Warlords. Rolling a little bit of gold for 1 or 2 rounds should help you reach that, as well as potentially hitting a few upgrades. The power spike should last until you're level 8, although you don't want to spend too much gold on level 6. You can also wait and roll more gold at level 7 if you feel like your stage 3 board isn't strong enough, or you don't mind sacking health. Don't sack too much health, especially if you're on a loss streak during stage 2. But once you hit level 7, which should be around 4-1, you can roll down to 30 or so gold to stabilize your board with upgrades. The goal here is to find Katarina 2, Jarvan 2, and at least 2 other Warlords 2-starred. You can also sell your early game Chosen, if you have one, at level 7 to increase your odds of hitting a 3-cost Chosen. Ideally, you'll hit Katarina, but Xin Zhao is also fine for a Warlord Chosen, otherwise you can settle for Jarvan or Vi. Throughout Stage 3 and most of Stage 4 is where you want your Warlords to be strongest. If you've hit upgrades and have Katarina 2, you should be able to coast towards level 8. If you high rolled it all and have a really strong board without rolling on level 7 and have 6 Warlords, you can easily fast 8 sometime between 4-3 and 5-1. How fast you level depends on your economy, but the general rule is level when you have at least 30 gold left over. Overall, the rest of Stage 4 is going to be spent saving gold and trying to hit level 8 sometime between 5-1 and 5-3. There is one other avenue of play at this point of the game, and that's slow rolling on level 7 instead of leveling. This playstyle runs the risk of getting outscaled by players hitting legendary champions, but if you're on track to hit a Katarina 3 relatively easily, it's definitely viable to slow roll. The goal here is to find Katarina 3 along with Jarvan 3 in either Xin Zhao or Vi 3. Keep in mind this is more of a risk than leveling to 8, but it can pay off. With level 8, let's go ahead and move into the late game. The late game for Warlords is not that great. The scaling they have during the mid game falls off pretty hard if you're using only 6 Warlords. So the goal during the end of Stage 5 and into Stage 6 is to do one of 3 things. One is to slow roll like we mentioned at level 7, and instead you'll do it at 8 with the intent of also finding Azir. Another option is to simply transition out of Warlords into a different comp. Play off of whatever chosen you hit when rolling at 8, generally a 4 cost. The last option is to play 9 Warlords, which is only possible with a chosen Warlord, an Azir, and a Spatula. All of these options are a viable way to play late game Warlords. It really just depends on the state of your board, bench, and economy. We will say that 9 Warlords with Katarina 3 has a really strong late game and can easily top 2. But it's also the hardest by far to hit, so realistically, you're either going to be rolling for 3-star Warlords or transitioning into a different build late game. Overall, Warlords are far from being the best composition in the meta, but due to their scaling, they can carry your early and mid game quite well. That's going to be all for today's video, folks. With a lot of viable builds in the meta, it helps knowing somewhat situational builds like Warlord. You don't necessarily need to know all the ins and outs of every build, but at least having a general idea can be a helpful tool in climbing ranked. Make sure you leave a comment for any builds you'd like us to cover in future How to Play videos. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for future Giant Slayer TFT videos.